Chapter 4, Biofeedback Training. The greatest thing, then, in all education is to make the nervous system our ally instead of our enemy. Quote by William James. Biofeedback training was developed by several researchers working independently in different parts of the country, mostly during the 1950s and 1960s. What is unique about what they did? They developed a new way to use electronic technology. The development can be thought of as technological breakthrough in sciences that study man. An outstanding feature of modern medical devices is extreme sensitivity, an outcome of the explosion of electronic technology during the following World War II. Such devices can detect from the surface of the skin exceedingly small electrophysiological signals. In biofeedback training procedure, these otherwise inaccessible signals are amplified, filtered, and displayed with great rapidity. Speed is another feature of the electronic systems. Deeply buried information about some ongoing activity inside the skin can be delivered, fed back to the subject while it is happening, second by second, for as long as it is desired. Why is this so important? It turns out that enhancing a person's sensitivity to or bringing to consciousness of psychophysiological processes ordinarily too subtle to be sensed makes it possible to develop a measure of voluntary control over these processes. Another way of saying this is that with the aid of biofeedback training, consciousness and control can be extended over normally unconscious and involuntary body processes. Biofeedback training is a tool for learning psychosomatic self-regulation. It may be possible to bring under some degree of voluntary control any physiological process that can be continuously monitored, amplified, and displayed. Research in many laboratories has demonstrated voluntary changes in such diverse functions as blood flow, heart rate, blood pressure, brain waves, gastrointestinal functions, and airflow in bronchial tubes for asthma control. Increased and in some cases restored control is paralyzed or spastic muscles also have been demonstrated. These developments are considered in some detail in Chapter 6. The earliest use of biofeedback training was probably made long ago by yogis learning to regulate the basal metabolism rate. This was accomplished by regulating breathing, for instance, learning to slow it to 1 breath per minute. Involuntary jerking of the diaphragm, the autonomic response to anoxia, fed back to consciousness the action of a normally unconscious process. One of the goals was to teach the body to be quiet, which indirectly is a control of the basal metabolism rate. Slow breathing was found to be associated with quietness. If the diaphragm did not jerk, the yogi could assume that learning was proceeding correctly. As will be seen later, the procedure qualifies as a non-instrumented form of biofeedback. Another non-instrumented kind of biofeedback was developed by Johannes Schultz in Germany when he taught patients to use feedback of heart rate in the third standard exercise, control of heart rate, of autogenic training. The instruction was to lay the hand on the chest over the heart until the heartbeat was detected, then tell the heart what to do, using the sensed beat as an indicator of progress. This feedback is vibratory rather than visual or auditory. It too qualifies as biofeedback. Instrumented biofeedback for a variety of purposes began at least as early as J.H. Baer's 1901 report called Development of Voluntary Control. We thank Barbara Brown for discovering this early study and reporting it in her book, New Mind, New Body, in 1974. Baer used an ingenious mechanical feedback device to train people to gain control of the muscles that wiggle the ears. As quoted by Brown, Baer said he undertook the study because the light its solution would throw upon the nature of the will, emphasis added. Another early report was made by Maurer and Maurer of 1938, who developed a way of controlling bedwetting in children by bringing them to consciousness when wetting began. An alarm system triggered by urine was all that was needed. Another kind of biofeedback was used by Lawrence Kuby, 1943, in training patients to get into a state of hypnagogic reverie in order to get information from the unconscious without the multiple distortions that occur in the dream process. Kuby fed back amplified breathing sounds as a monotonous, fixating stimulus and observed a great quieting of the body as a result, a state conducive to gaining awareness of hypnagogic imagery. An impressive early use of biofeedback was reported by Hagen, Dixon, and Dickel, 1963, in training patients suffering from anxiety tension to control their electromyographic muscle behavior as seen on an oscilloscope. In conjunction with this, they use a form of progressive relaxation, Jacobson of 1938, for home training. It was Joe Kamaya, however, who was responsible for triggering the current wave of interest in biofeedback possibilities when he began to report in the early 1960s that alpha brain wave rhythms could be detected and self-regulated by college students. It was from Joe Kamaya, in fact, that Elmer first heard of brainwave feedback, a meeting of the Psychophysiological Research Society in 1965. This intrigued us because it suggested another physiological indicator that would be useful in research involving voluntary control of the nervous system, in this case, the central nervous system. At a later meeting of the Psychophysiological Research Society, Elmer and I met Barbara Brown and heard her describe her research with EEG feedback to investigate the subjective correlates of beta, alpha, and theta occipital brain rhythms. In the mid-1960s, voluntary control studies using biofeedback techniques were blossoming all around the country. To name only a few, Basmajian, 1963, and Marinacci, 1968, reported on EMG research. Anatiau and Lang, 1965, on heart rate. Hardick, Petronovich, and Ellsworth in 1966 on control of speech muscles during silent reading. At the Veterans Administration Hospital in New Bedford, Massachusetts, Dr. Thomas Mulholland and his associates were using EEG feedback instrumentation in investigating problems of vision in 1962-1966. Our own interest, as we have said, centered on the study of relationships in the mind-body domain. In 1965, we began our research on muscle tension and the control of skin temperature, blood flow in the hands through the use of autogenic training, phases, and visualization, which when combined with biofeedback became the basis of the migraine study described in the last chapter. In what follows, we will describe how we apply biofeedback training in working with patients and discuss the larger implications of our studies of autogenic feedback training for warmth control and various related questions that emerged in our laboratory and clinical work. We wish to focus attention on what is known about mind-body coordination for two reasons. The first is to point out that much of the information is not new, but is firmly based in medical and psychological science. The second and more important reason is to let people know how orderly, reasonable, and logical biofeedback is. There is a usefulness in showing how biofeedback works that far outweighs all academic considerations. That of helping patients, trainees, learn voluntary control of internal states. For long-lasting results in biofeedback training, it is important that patients have a clear understanding of what they are doing and realize that neither the machines nor the doctors are making anything happen. It is the patient who does it. Often physicians do not explain what is taking place to their patients. Patients are often not capable of interpreting medical terms and understanding complex explanations, and busy doctors can seldom take the time to explain a problem in layman's language. This is one of the undesirable side effects of scientific medicine. As it has grown increasingly sophisticated and specialized, it has forgotten its humanistic manners. as well as the role of the patient in its own healing. In working with patients, we have found it effective to explain figures 1 and 2 to them, with the understanding that we do not expect them to remember details unless they want to. But we want them to realize and remember that the ultimate machinery for self-regulation is within each person. For instance, I talked with the first migraine patient with whom we worked, Lillian Petroni, for about an hour about the coordination between psychological and physiological processes before starting her on a course of temperature training. A brief training session followed, then she took the temperature trainer home to practice twice daily by herself. The point is that the time she left my office with the machine, she understood that there was a psychophysiological process that she could influence and that the machine would help by providing immediate information about very small changes in skin temperature. The machine helped increase her awareness of warmth in her hands. In about 200 subjects tested in our laboratory, wired up so that we could measure simultaneously skin temperature and blood flow in the fingers, we have found a very close correspondence between temperature and blood volume. In general, if there is an increase in blood volume, there is an increase in temperature about 15 to 20 seconds later. People cannot normally sense changes in the diameter of the blood vessels in their hands, of course, nor can they determine by unaided internal sensing skin temperature changes of their hands within a range of 3 or 4 degrees Fahrenheit. Without temperature training, some people cannot sense a change in temperature even within a range of 10 degrees. In contrast, that striking lack of awareness and sensitivity consider this. The temperature trainer we use for feedback purposes displays the needle movement of 1/10 of an inch for each 1/10 of a degree change in temperature, and the smallest wiggle of that needle can be seen represents about 1/100th of a degree, a very small temperature change. When I designed our first temperature feedback machine, I made it too sensitive and the needle moved up and down almost continuously. There was so much movement that it was difficult to know what it was responsible for. Few subjects were able to correlate the behavior of the machine. With internal cues until the machine was made less sensitive. If a person could normally sense a temperature change in the hands within 4 degrees, then the machine is approximately 400 times more sensitive than the person, so that one's ability to notice changes in the warmth of the hands is increased 400 times while watching the machine. Because of this, we sometimes refer to biofeedback training as consciousness training or awareness training. This electronically enhanced sensitivity provides information that makes it possible to learn to regulate hand temperature. Let us look closely at self-regulation of hand temperature. Just what is it that a person learns to control? At first glance, one would say it's skin temperature. But just below the skin, it is blood volume that is being regulated, and this is directly proportional to the diameter of blood vessels. When blood vessels increase in diameter, blood volume increases, and within seconds, the temperature of the finger begins to rise. The diameter of blood vessels in turn is regulated by smooth muscles in the vessel walls. In the hands, this smooth muscle is controlled exclusively by action of the sympathetic section of the autonomic nervous system. And this in turn is regulated from a center of vascular control that lies in an involuntary part of the central nervous system. At the top of the control hierarchy, then, we find a regulator in the brain subcortex that normally functions outside the realm of consciousness. And in order to learn voluntary control of hand temperature, one must develop a kind of awareness of normally unconscious involuntary events. External feedback of temperature changes activates the conscious visual cortex, and gradually one learns to correlate one sees with subtle internal sensations that were previously unconscious. These sensations may not be describable in words, but when they come to consciousness, it becomes possible to control them. When these sensations are controlled at will, then in some autonomic way, the body changes to correspond with the consciously programmed sensation. There is another way to say it. The person visualizes and feels the desired change that will influence the meter and allows the body to carry out the instruction. The feeling seems to be the instruction. This feeling has been reported by many successful performers to be, at least in the early stages of learning, a composite of imagery, emotion, and body sensation. But after a skill is thoroughly learned, the body sensation can be turned on at will, often with no need for any particular mental image or emotion. In order to organize the major ideas we are discussing, it is useful to refer to Figure 1, a presentation of the brain and nervous systems and their arrangement in conscious and unconscious domains. The solid horizontal line represents the average theoretical dividing line between conscious and unconscious parts of the peripheral nervous system, or PNS. The central nervous system is divided into cortex and subcortex. The subcortex section includes the spinal cord. The peripheral nervous system includes both the voluntary craniospinal section, which operates our normal muscular apparatus of everyday life, and the autonomic involuntary system with its two divisions, sympathetic and parasympathetic, not shown specifically, which control vital functions and constitute the logistic support apparatus that, when operating properly, keeps us alive without our having to think about it. In the average person, activity in the voluntary nervous system, the craniospinal nervous system, occurs in the normally conscious domain, and autonomic nervous system activity occurs involuntarily and unconsciously. Control of the diameter of blood vessels is not an exception to this general rule, according to medical textbooks. Yet, with more than 2,000 trainees, we found that blood flow control in the hands is a remarkably easier thing to learn. The autonomic or automatic nervous system is controlled by subcortical brain structures, visceral, circulatory, glandular, and other system. Such basic processes are dependent upon autonomic nervous system. Its two classes of activity, sympathetic and parasympathetic, act together essentially. One controls the upper limit of physiological activity and the other the lower limit. For instance, if excitement speeds up the heart too much, a built-in control unit, the parasympathetic operations to slow it down. If it slows excessively, another autonomic control circuit acts to speed it up. Many of the involuntary processes of the body are regulated by these two control functions. Blood flow in the peripheral parts of the body, however, the arms and legs, hands and feet, is controlled only by action in the sympathetic section of the autonomic nervous system. The only way that one can warm the hands intentionally is to increase the blood flow, and the major way the blood flow can be increased. Other things being essentially equal, for example, unchanged body position, is to decrease sympathetic firing. Sympathetic firing is controlled from the brain at the hypothalamus. So in order to warm the hands, volitionally, it is necessary to turn down sympathetic tone at the source, the hypothalamic control center. Because this control center regulates blood flow throughout the body, when a person learns to warm hands, vascular relaxation and rebalancing often occur over the entire body. Presumably, this is what takes place when the temperature control technique is used to treat migraine and Raynaud's disease. Learning to warm the hands at will, then, is essentially learning to decrease activation in the sympathetic nervous system. The stresses of life activate the sympathetic nervous system, also known as fight or flight system. Such activation increases blood pressure and heart rate, bringing about general activation of the body. If the tension level in the sympathetic nervous system does not drop when the crisis has passed, when the need for activation is over, but instead remains high, then psychosomatic disorders may ensue. The next few pages present a summary of the most of the biofeedback concepts we have been discussing. In Figure 2, we have drawn a flowchart representing the significant events of self-regulation. The conception falls in the domain of cybernetics, a branch of science concerned with communication and control founded by mathematician Norbert Wiener 30 years ago. Specifically, Figure 2 is a representation of processes that occur simultaneously in the voluntary and involuntary neurological domain and in the conscious and unconscious psychological domain. The upper half of the diagram represents the normal domain of conscious processes, that is, processes of which we normally have awareness when we wish it. The lower half of the diagram represents the normal domain of unconscious processes. As mentioned before, the neurological location of conscious processes seems to be in the cerebral cortex and the craniospinal apparatus. The normal location of unconscious processes appears to be in the subcortical brain and in the autonomic nervous system. Electrophysiological studies indicate the cerebral perceptions of outside the skin, outs events such as telephone calls. Upper left body of the diagram have associated with the upper left box of the diagram have associated with them arrow 1 electrical activity in both conscious and unconscious structures that involved emotional and mental responses. The two boxes labeled emotional and mental response have been placed on the midline of the diagram, divided by the horizontal center line into conscious and unconscious parts in order to show their two-domain nature. The lower left box, limbic response, is placed entirely in the unconscious section of the diagram, though some neural pathways lead from limbic structures directly to cortical regions, implying that information from limbic processes can reach consciousness, or that consciousness can reach down to information in the limbic system. The limbic system is an important link between emotions and the body. It has been intensely studied in both animals and humans since J.W. Papez's historical paper in 1937 outlining its function and emotional responses. Paul MacLean of 1949 coined the phrase visceral brain for the limbic system, and others have referred to it as the emotional brain. The relevant point is that emotional states are reflected in or correlated with electrophysiological activity in the limbic system. Of major significance is the fact that the limbic system is connected by many neural pathways represented by arrow 3 to the central control panel of the brain. The hypothalamus located on the center line at the bottom of the brain above the roof of the mouth. The hypothalamus weighs only about 4 grams, only 1/7 of an ounce. But it regulates a large part of the body's automatic neural machinery in addition to controls to a large extent. The pituitary gland, which is attached to it. The pituitary gland is the so-called king gland of the body, is at the top of the hormonal hierarchy. Its action can precipitate or trigger off changes in other glandular structures throughout the body. With these concepts in mind, it is easy to understand how news from a telephone message can cause a person to faint or to have a surge of blood pressure. To summarize, the perception of outs events leads to limbic, hypothalamic glandular responses, and of course, arrow 4 physiological changes represented by the box at the lower right in the diagram are the inevitable consequence. To this point, the information is not new. Most of it was known by 1947. What is new is the fact that if a physiological change is detected by a sensitive electronic instrument and fed back to a person by a lighter tone, arrow 5, that person is thereby provided with visual or auditory information about the inside skin events, which can be used to learn control of the process. We can say the person perceives in a certain way what is going on inside the skin. The ease in learning and degree of success are different for different people, but the fact remains that voluntary autonomic learning is possible. Based on experience with hundreds of persons over a period of years, it seems to us that it is reasonable to conclude that biofeedback works because the feedback in INS information generates, results in, or causes a new emotional response, a response to normally unconscious INS information. The new emotional response is associated with a new limbic response. It combines with or replaces, modifies the original limbic response. The new limbic response, in turn, develops a new pattern of hypothalamic firing and pituitary secretion, and a new physiological state ensues. Thus, a closed cybernetic loop is established. Closing the cybernetic loop seems to bridge the normal gap between conscious and unconscious processes, between voluntary and involuntary processes. In learning voluntary control of normally unconscious processes, we do not become directly aware of the neural pathways and muscle fibers involved, any more than we become aware of what cerebral and subcerebral nerves are involved in playing ping pong. But as in ping pong, when we get external objective visual feedbacks, we can learn to modify the internal setup so as to bring about changes in the desired direction. Again, it is worth noting that without exception, everything that is learned with feedback of some kind, whether it involves the corticostriate system or the cortico-subcortico autonomic system. During the first interview with the patient, in order to help him understand what biofeedback training is about, we explain figure 2. By the time that explanation is completed, the person knows about mental emotional apparatus and the physiological apparatus involved in making biofeedback work. He may not have had faith in his own ability to learn conscious voluntary control of hand temperature, but we try to leave no doubt that the mind and body influence each other. In discussing figure 2 with patients, we generally say that our purpose in presenting this information is merely to let them know that the circuits and control systems are all there inside them. We talk about the workings of the involuntary nervous system of which people are usually unaware, and which normally they need make no effort to regulate, and point out that the traditional difference between learning in the voluntary and the autonomic system has hinged on the presence or absence of feedback or information to the cortex. We use the example of an automobile and talked of the need for visual feedback in learning to drive a car. In learning to drive, we get feedback by looking out the windshield. But with the autonomic nervous system, we normally do not have feedback, a handicap in attempting to learn self-regulation. If we are given feedback of a normally unconscious and voluntary process, in many cases it is possible to learn to control or regulate it if we want to. Wanting to is essential, and we will say more about this later. Often biofeedback is not intended for more than a few weeks. Most important, biofeedback is not addictive because voluntary internal control is established rather than dependence on any external agency. Drugs are often addictive, and dosages almost need to be increased in order to compensate for the body's natural habituation. With biofeedback, voluntary sensitivity to subtle internal cues is increased rather than decreased, and therefore the use of feedback devices need be only temporary. This increased sensitivity indicated by arrow 8 is an essential step in closing the internal cybernetic loop. In other words, as voluntary sensitivity increases, the patient is able to become aware of what is going on inside the skin, whenever that is useful, and eventually no longer needs external feedback. This freedom from the machine was illustrated in one of Bernard Engel's tachycardia patients who, after some weeks of biofeedback practice, said that she did not need this heart rate machine anymore in order to know how fast her heart was beating. Engel, 1970. She was aware of her heart rate anytime she turned her attention to it. In terms of a diagram, she used arrow 5 and 6 at first. Then arrow 8 began to develop, accompanied by the formation of arrows 9 and 10, When these two were well developed, she no longer needed arrows 5, 6, and 8, and the machine was no longer necessary. The internal control loop, arrows 9, 10, 7, 3, 4, 9, have been established. She could now modify her own dynamic equilibrium without external aids. She could adjust the homeostatic, physiologically self-regulating balance point involving heart rate at will by making internal changes. She learned to choose the psychophysiological states that were productive of self-regulation, such as a certain kind of breathing and a certain response or lack of response to environmental stress. It is an important empirical finding that in self-regulating a physiological response to psychological stress, the biofeedback patient apparently handles the stress itself in a satisfactory way. This result probably stems from that fact. First recognized by Johannes Schultz that when a patient's motivation and volition bring about recovery from a psychosomatic problem, there is little need for another symptom. Another way of putting it to say that when autogenic feedback training is used, it seems as if the problem is erased from brain structures. The patient apparently self-deconditions both psychologically and physiologically. Although volition has been an implicit ingredient in the previous discussion, it is now necessary to distinguish two types of volition associated with voluntary and involuntary parts of the nervous system. The normally conscious voluntary sections of the nervous system, the cortical and craniospinal in figures 1 and 2, respond in particular to active volition, and the normally unconscious and involuntary sections, the subcortical and autonomic, respond in particular to passive volition. Active volition is familiar type we use every day of our lives without thinking about it. Passive volition, on the other hand, must be consciously developed and used. In autogenic training, reference is made to passive concentration as a technique for bringing about changes in the autonomic nervous system. Because instruments reveal moment by moment physiological behavior, the effects of different strategies can be easily and rapidly tested. If people try to force their hands to get warm with active willpower, the hands always get cooler. If a subject then stops his strategy, the temperature of the hands usually increase, which gives us a good opportunity to explain passive volition. One just tells the body what to do, usually by visualizing the desired state, then detaches from the situation, steps aside, gets out of the way, so to speak, and allows the body to do it. Another example of the difference between active and passive volition is in falling deep asleep. If you try to force yourself to go to sleep, you become more awake, and the harder you try, the less you succeed, until finally you are exhausted and wide awake. With passive volition, however, you visualize and feel the body becoming quiet, the emotions becoming tranquil, and the thoughts stopping. Effort itself is turned off. Our normally involuntary and unconscious sections can often learn to behave in ways that are consciously chosen if we visualize what is wanted and ask the being, body, mind, brain, unconscious, or whatever to do it. A metaphoric way of putting it to say the cortex plants the idea in the subcortex and then allows nature to take its course without interference. That is passive volition. The operational idea is suggested by the cortex plants and is analogous to farming. There is an apt correspondence between inside the skin response to our volition and nature's response to a farmer's volition. The farmer desires and visualizes the crop, plants the seed in the earth, allows nature to take its course, and reaps. In a corresponding way, we desire and visualize a certain kind of physiological behavior. This is a conscious cortical process. Plant the idea in the unconscious, the earth of our physiological being, and let nature take its course, and reap mind-body stability. In this context, our personal unconscious can be thought of as nature inside our skins. The paradox of passive volition inside the skin must be lived to be understood. When it is lived, inner harmony seems to be reflected outside the skin. Many biofeedback trainees have told us that people have said to them that they look different, they seem different, their personalities are different, they appear more poised. We try to guard against telling a new patient too much about this possibility in order to prevent the creation of anticipatory resistance or fear in the patient. Furthermore, we wish to prevent a Pollyanna optimism or overblown expectation of change. A fear of change is experienced by most of us if change means giving up something we know for something we don't know. One psychiatric patient said to me, "How do I know I want self control? Maybe life is better the way I am now." In addition to being cautious, when talking with patients, it is advisable when talking with colleagues not to give the impression of being an enthusiast. To be enthusiastic is permissible, but to be an enthusiast means that judgments are probably biased continuously in favor of beliefs. We try to remain on the conservative side, though it is not always easy. In working with patients, we do not often point out that the detachment to which we refer is a basic feature of yogic training. Yogis found out long ago that the autonomic nervous system does not respond to force. There are other similarities between biofeedback training and yoga. The most obvious similarity is that both are systems of self regulation in contrast to programming through hypnosis, symptom control through drugs, and direct surgical modification of the patient. In yoga, even though the student follows a system in order to learn self regulation, he alone is responsible for its application. The same degree of responsibility is found in biofeedback training. The machines do nothing but detect physiological processes and represent the information to a patient, but it sometimes takes 2 or 3 weeks before the patient is convinced of the passive nature of biofeedback machines, that they are simply like mirrors. Psychosomatic disease can be thought of as a distortion of healthy mind-body functioning that begins when psychological stress is allowed to disrupt the neural and humoral sequences of homeostatic events. A mechanical structure of psychophysiological process that is strained by beyond its elastic limit cannot regain its original shape or function when the stress is relieved, even if an outside force is applied to the opposite direction. For instance, sudden powerful psychological stress can strain the human psychophysiological apparatus beyond its limits of natural recovery. Reference to this phenomena is repeatedly heard in such phrases as, "His hair turned white overnight and she'll never be the same." It is not necessary for stress to be overpoweringly traumatic or unpleasant. However, it is to result these for it to result in psychosomatic disorder. For instance, a verbal insult often results in nothing more than a momentary feeling of discomfort. But if its effects are allowed to persist through brooding over the memory and re-experiencing the emotions, physiological changes are bound to take place sooner or later. Voluminous neurological and biochemical evidence scattered throughout the literature testifies that chronic emotional strain is accompanied by chronic changes in homeostasis. The good side of this tight mind-body correlation is the implication that an emotional state may be volitionally selected for correction of an undesirable physiological state, such as a psychosomatic disorder or a drug dependency problem. And now, biofeedback, which shows the physiological response to a new emotional state, is available as a new and powerful tool for implementing psychophysiological self-regulation and psychosomatic health. Later on in this book, in Chapter 6, we will present the many different clinical uses of biofeedback training that are being developed and again discuss psychosomatic health. Now, however, let us go beyond the immediate clinical applications of biofeedback training, exciting and important as they are, to consider other ramifications of self-regulation.